This statuette represents King Tutankhamun wearing the crown of Lower Egypt with the protective cobra on his brow. He strides confidently forward, holding in one hand a flail for collecting the incense gum that oozes from the shrubs growing beside his pastures. In his other hand he grasps a long crook for controlling his flocks. He is, in fact, the good shepherd about his duties. This statuette was among a number of images of the gods stored in a chamber of the tomb which Howard Carter described as a treasury. Similar examples have been found in other royal tombs, but they differ from this one in being terribly damaged and made in wood coated with black resin, not covered like this specimen with gold, the very flesh of the gods. They've all been found in tombs in the Valley of the Kings at Western Thebes, where some 30 pharaohs who once held the civilized world in awe had their last resting place.
Here, under the sacred peak that dominates the Valley of the Kings, lies the most recently discovered of all the royal tombs, that of Tutankhamun himself. Across the river from the hills into which the Valley of the Kings is cut, stand some of the most impressive ruins of ancient Egypt, the great temples of Luxor and Karnak. The town of Luxor and the nearby village Karnak are built upon parts of the ruins of the ancient capital city of southern Egypt, Thebes, and it is at Thebes that so much of the ancient Egyptian past has survived. But it has not always been in the apparently good condition that visitors see today. Generations of Egyptologists have removed whole villages from above the ruins, meticulously copied the inscriptions, consolidated the foundations, and restored the broken walls. The work is still carried on, now by Egyptian archaeologists, assisted by foreign teams. The foundation of the pillared hall of the great temple at Karnak disintegrated at the end of the last century, bringing down some of the huge columns. They were re-erected, using almost the same simple but effective methods as the ancient Egyptian masons had employed over 3,000 years earlier. Thebes was the capital of Upper Egypt, the part of the country that lies upstream and so in the south. Its official buildings, though greatly ruined, have survived much more completely than those of the ancient northern capital, Memphis, and have thereby given a false emphasis to the importance of the southern city. Memphis was the real capital of ancient Egypt from earliest times, until the Arab conquerors in 641 AD demolished much of it for material to build their own new city some 10 miles to the north, in what is now a part of modern Cairo. Since then, the ruins have almost entirely disappeared, although archaeologists have uncovered the scanty remains of several palaces and temples. The glory of both these ancient capitals, Memphis and Thebes, was the creation of the kings of Egypt. The first pharaoh, Menes, who conquered the northern lands of Lower Egypt and so united the country, is traditionally reputed to have been the founder of Memphis, or White Walls, as the ancient Egyptians called it, in about 3100 BC. Menes is usually identified with the king Narmer, whose slate palette is among the oldest historical objects found in Egypt. The palette is a ceremonial version of a plate upon which cosmetics were ground. Around the central dish is a design perhaps symbolizing, in the entwined necks of two mythical lions, the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt by King Narmer. The king is shown at the base of the palette as a great bull smashing the forts of his enemies. His name, Narmer, is carved in one of the earliest examples of hieroglyphic writing, above a figure of the king wearing the traditional crown of Lower Egypt. His sandal-bearer follows behind him, and he is preceded by his standard-bearers, bearing the totemic emblems of the various parts of his kingdom. His defeated enemies lie in decapitated rows before him. Menes built his residence, White Walls, on land that he had reclaimed by diverting the course of the Nile, and this nucleus remained the citadel of Memphis for over 3,000 years. Although it has long since vanished in dust, We can still get some idea of the palace's original appearance, as represented on his palette, from the house facade that contains his name, and from the limestone walls, now baked by the sun to a burnt gold, which the great Chancellor Imhotep built for his king Zoser at Saqqara, in the same style, some 5 centuries after Narmer. Imhotep raised the world's first stone building of any size in this funerary monument, a residence city of the dead in which Zoser would rule forevermore, and the surrounding walls of which must reproduce the appearance of the royal residence of the living king. In this case, these girdle walls enclose a vast complex whose centerpiece is the step pyramid of King Zoser, the prototype of all the later pyramids, built about 4,700 years ago. Imhotep, who designed and built this place, must have been an architect of great genius, to have been bold enough to translate into stone forms and patterns that had previously existed only in mud brick and wood. It seems that working for the first time in stone, the builders of Zoser's pyramid complex were not yet confident enough to erect freestanding columns, but preferred to engage them in walls of stone blocks. At the foot of the pyramid itself, there survives a small room which vividly expresses the power and importance of the Pharaoh of Egypt. Set in the wall of the chamber that faces out from the pyramid are 2 eye holes, through which Zoser could sniff the incense and see the offerings brought to him. The Pharaoh is the classic example of the god incarnate as king. This concept comes from that layer in Egyptian culture that belongs to Africa, where similar rulers have existed until recently. A tangible god, the Pharaoh was from the start a divine leader whom the entire nation united in following. Thus Zoser tramples on the 9 bows of his foreign enemies, while the lapwings, who are his own people of Egypt, lie helpless before him. The scene depicted upon this mace head of a southern king who probably preceded Narmer and the unification of Egypt reveals, when reconstructed, something of the prehistoric origins of the Pharaoh. He is shown performing a ceremony known as the piercing of the dikes, one of the many rituals designed to ensure that the waters of the Nile rose with unfailing regularity and were properly used. The king is again surrounded, like Narmer upon his cosmetic palette, by his soldiers, officials, and personal attendants, including his sandal bearer. Watched by his queen from her palanquin, the king cuts the first clod of earth from a dike, in observance of a rite that persisted at least for the next 2,000 years. The rainmaker or pastoral chief of Egyptian prehistory was thus transformed over the years into the pharaoh, able to sustain and protect the nation by having command over the Nile, a very useful attribute in a rainless land. His prehistoric origins are visible in the shepherd's crook and flail he carried, and in the artificial goat beard that he wore. The pharaoh wore various different crowns, which were themselves divine, the repositories of numinous power. The tall white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt. Both usually bore the image of a divine serpent spitting venom in the eyes of his enemies. It was not his insignia only that made the king divine. An ancient folk story relates how the first 3 kings of the 5th dynasty were born of the wife of a mere priest by the sun god Re himself. And this fiction of a divine birth for the pharaoh is preserved for as long as the kingship lasted in Egypt. The most celebrated version of this myth is represented on the walls of the funerary temple of Queen Hatshepsut at western Thebes. The designs are badly damaged now, but it is still possible to make out the story. The first panel of the series shows the sun god Amun visiting Hatshepsut's mother, Queen Amuza, and filling her with the divine spirit. He does this symbolically by holding out towards her nose the ancient Egyptian sign for life, the loop-handled cross, or Ankh. The ram-headed creator god is then commanded to fashion the child Hatshepsut and her spiritual self as twin infants on his potter's wheel. The messenger of the gods is sent to give the glad tidings to Queen Amosa, who is led into the birth chamber by the goddesses of childbirth. Hatshepsut is born and suckled by the divine nurses. And finally, the child is recognized by the sun god. The entire cycle of conception, gestation, birth, and recognition is the concern only of the gods. King Thutmose III of the 15th century BC similarly claims that it was Amun of Thebes who recognized him as his son, as he was serving as a mere boy in the temple at Karnak, when the heavens opened and he flew up like a divine falcon to be crowned by the sun god. Though this is probably a fanciful way of saying that it was his earthly father Thutmose II who crowned him in the sanctuary of the temple as his co-regent. The harmony between the pharaoh and the natural world is seen particularly in the intimate connection between the pharaoh and the Nile, upon which Egypt's prosperity depended. The coronation of the king took place at a time heralded by the rising of the bright star Sirius at the beginning of the flood. At this auspicious moment, the new pharaoh was depicted as a babe cradled in the lotus that arose out of the waters of chaos. Each king, therefore, at his advent, was regarded as recreating the old universe anew in the primal pattern that had come down intact from the time when the gods had ruled the earth. The god's son and incarnation was on the throne of his ancestors, and when he died and was assimilated to Osiris, the god of the dead, his son would reign in his stead. Thus Egypt was eternally under the beneficent rule of the god. This idea is expressed in the tomb of Tutankhamun, in the paintings that cover the walls above the sarcophagus, showing how the dead king becomes identified with the ruler of the dead, Osiris, by the activities of the living king. The youthful Tutankhamun had no son of his own to succeed him, and the throne passed to one Ai, perhaps only distantly related to him. But by performing the proper magical rituals before the image of his predecessor, King Ai ensured that the dead pharaoh should become an effective god, still working for the prosperity of the land that his successor now ruled. The king was dead. Long live the king.
They that were hungry are satisfied, and they that thirsted are assuaged. They that were in prison are released, and he that was fettered is full of joy. They that were at strife in this land are reconciled. High Niles have come, that they may refresh the heart.
So sang the scribe at the accession of Ramesses IV. When Meneptah came to the throne less than a century earlier, similar paeans were sung.
Rejoice, O land, in your entirety. A goodly time has come. A Lord has arisen for all countries. The water stands and fails not, and the Nile carries a high flood. The gods are content and joyful, and life is spent in laughter and wonder.
But even in death, the pharaoh could still dominate the life of the valley. On the verges of the cultivation, the pyramid, in its geometrical perfection, symbolized that primeval mound that arose from the waters of chaos at the world's beginning, and in which the Creator manifested himself. The pyramids were intended to house the bodies of the early kings of Egypt and to last forever. They were long ago robbed of all their contents. And indeed, entrance into the Great Pyramid of Giza is made today via a robber's tunnel. But the pyramids themselves remain, the most striking realization of the power of the early pharaohs. burial chamber, at the heart of the Great Pyramid, the plain black sarcophagus in which the king was to rest forever lies empty and a little damaged. But directly above the empty chamber, the pharaoh's pyramid still thrusts its capstone into the realms of the sky, where his soul beholds the sun god daily. A Lord has arisen for all countries. It was not only that the Pharaoh was Lord of Egypt, he was the master of the circuit of the sun's disk. The neighboring nations recognized that the divine ruler of so rich, so unified, and so powerful a state as Egypt was a god indeed. At his advent, they journeyed to him bearing rich gifts and seeking his blessing. The idea of this god incarnate, his birth and coronation, bequeathed a legend and a tradition to the nations of the Near East, which persisted for thousands of years and has its echoes in Christian beliefs.